Okay, before I start, just get everyone's hands up if you've heard of MITRE ATT&CK before. I just want to kind of read the room. Okay, so hands up. Okay. Hands up if you use MITRE ATT&CK at work, so in a professional setting. A little bit less. And what about, hands up again, if you think you use ATT&CK well? One person, two people. Okay, cool. Small number. Okay, so this is all the stuff we're going to try and cover off today. We've got quite a bit of ground to get through, and there's some quite meaty topics, so we're going to have to move pretty fast. To do this, I've made a bunch of assumptions and predications around what organizations tend to look like. But we should acknowledge here there's a bias towards quote-unquote normal organizations to allow us to do this. So why did I want to give this talk? This was born out of some of the frustrations and learnings I've had from working with ATT&CK. This means we're going to try and look at some of the art behind the science. And hopefully by being here today, we can at least sort of explore some of the perils and pitfalls that I've seen, and you can sort of think about some ways that you might be able to address them. In particular, we're going to try to look at this problem in a New Zealand context. We have our own unique set of circumstances which have helped shape the way things evolved here. And we're going to use that same context to help shape the conversation as well, because a lot of the content about ATT&CK that's out there is aimed at CTI teams, which, as we'll discuss, you don't likely have access to. So just some acronyms before I start. ATT&CK is a knowledge base of adversarial tactics and techniques. ATT&CK was made by some people called at MITRE, and MITRE is a not-for-profit that works very closely with the US government. TTP stands for Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, and these represent activities that adversaries can conduct, whereas an IOC stands for an Indicator of Compromise, and this represents a digital artifact associated with malicious activity. And CTI, of course, stands for Cyber Threat Intelligence. Okay, so let's zoom out and start with a look at CTI and some of the market forces we have in New Zealand. So I'm going to front load this by saying that threat intelligence almost doesn't exist in New Zealand. And by that I mean we have near zero people working in developing or working with threat intelligence as a day job. Obviously we have a few organizations that specialize in intelligence within the government. We have almost no professional CTI. And that's likely because cyber maturity in New Zealand is very low. Even amongst cybersecurity professionals, threat intelligence is often seen as a really dark and obscure art performed by people overseas. And where we do consume intelligence in a commercial context, at least, it's almost entirely produced offshore as well. So why might this be? Why is CTI so hard to find? If we're here, we have like a maturity scale, right? And this is one way we can look at how organizations acquire new security technology. Threat intelligence is something pretty far off at the top of the ladder. Pretty much everyone covers off those really foundational steps, but very few organizations seem to make it all the way to the top. And subsequently, threat intelligence is seen as something that's difficult to consume, it's expensive, and it's difficult to quantify. In practice, all of those lower steps, they contain their own forms of intelligence, but it's being shaped and filtered to you by the vendor or the provider of the service. And that probably makes sense if you've got 10 seats in your org, right? But what about if you've got 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000? Or, you know, as often in the case in New Zealand, what about if some of these technologies or services are outsourced, right? You've got a service provider, what do they understand about threat intelligence? I don't necessarily want to suggest this is a problem, but it does reflect the status quo. And because of that, we sort of answer the who's, the whys, the where's, the how's very late in the cycle. By the time we have people who are able to understand those concepts, those lower steps and the technologies they represent are somewhat locked into place. So this is the somewhat cynical security Ouroboros. You may recognize yourself somewhere in this cycle. It begins with identifying a risk. Consultants or service providers start to whisper in your ears about a solution, and in all likelihood you don't have any money. Then after some time, often years, you will get some budget and you'll acquire the technology, almost certainly skipping over the people and the processes bit, and you're going to end up feeling dissatisfied and starting the cycle again. This loop exists because organizations grow organically. IT moves really fast as well, so we don't hire enterprise architects to sort of design what an organization is going to look like in 10 years' time. If they did draw up plans for the future, by the time we were ready for them, they'd be out of date, right? The technology just wouldn't be relevant anymore. We also have this, which is the 2020 Redux, where you get ransomware, some consultants come, you get ransomware again, you buy some more stuff, you get ransomware again, and so on and so forth. So if we abstract ourselves a little bit higher and look down about what we've talked about, we can see that New Zealand doesn't really have any sort of sign of cyber self-sufficiency in a broad sense. I like to say that we're roughly 10 years behind Australia, and to try and quantify that, I'd encourage you to look at some of the programs they have over there, like JCSC or MSP3, as examples of reasonably affordable and practical things that we don't have any sort of direct equivalency in New Zealand. So even the very largest businesses in New Zealand and government departments, they rely pretty heavily on technical expertise from outside. This isn't just CTI, but other specialist areas like incident response or forensics. So given some sort of proverbial cyber conflict, or at least a situation where those sort of skills were suddenly very much in contention globally, New Zealand just wouldn't have enough access to domestic talent to defend or respond to our own networks. So let's take a look at some SEEK job data to try and quantify the lack of CTI expertise onshore. Australia is roughly 5 times bigger than New Zealand, as we know, in terms of population. So it stands to reason there'd be roughly 5 times as many jobs in Australia mentioning CTI as there is in New Zealand, right? So this is from the 1st of October, and we can see that there's 3 jobs on SEEK, it's a little bit hard to see, that mention threat intelligence. And if we move to Australia, there's 72. So, and to be fair, one of those 3 jobs actually was the same job listed twice. I didn't deduplicate the Australian job data, but you kind of get the picture. So today in New Zealand, there's about 6 jobs on SEEK that mention threat intelligence, and that's mostly because NCSC's gone on a hiring spree, it looks like. But at any given moment, there's roughly 10 times as many people in CTI jobs in Australia as there are in New Zealand. And I'd make the comment that those Australian jobs are often really, really high paid, and they involve working with or developing intelligence, whereas the New Zealand roles often just mention it in passing. So we're at the very dawn or start of sort of groups coalescing around intelligence sharing. Unfortunately, organizations that could probably use this the most, they're the least likely to be doing it. And by that, I mean that they're probably the least mature or the least regulated. In practice, this means everyone who's not an FS-ISAC. Regulated industries typically place more value on risk, so they've been willing to collaborate effectively if it means they can reduce that risk. The groups that we do have that share intelligence, they mostly do it in unstructured ways as well. So they're swapping around IOCs rather than focusing on sort of the higher level issues or campaigns. And there's also a code of silence. So organizations definitely do not want to disclose that they've been compromised. But they're also reluctant to say that they've detected and shut down something, or even to share simple indicators. So the people who are doing this technical sharing, they're often doing it without the express permission of the organization that they work for. And unfortunately, it's not all that uncommon to see this information being handled inappropriately as well. So we see things like misfeeds, push-style indicators, junior analysts reaching out and touching adversary infrastructure, or handling malware unsafely, or people just forwarding malicious URLs. And one of the reasons we do this to each other is because we actually lack people who are trained in how to do these things safely. So in summary, we can say that New Zealand sort of lacks technical expertise and leadership because we haven't placed enough value on cybersecurity. This leaves us with service providers and vendors filling the void, both of whom are inherently partisan. This leaves us with lots of room to grow, but what's been the biggest driver here hasn't actually been law reform in recent times. It's been people getting shredded with ransomware, or in the past few weeks getting DOSed and melting your border device or your file or your website. So strangely enough, this makes Eastern European cyber criminals the MVPs of security uplift in New Zealand right now. We also missed an opportunity with our new Privacy Act. We can imagine how much stronger of a position we would have likely been in if in 5 or 10 years' time, say, if we'd done what the UK did and just copied word for word the GDPR, or even closer to home, the Australian Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at ATT&CK In the Wild. I'm going to do a lot of talking about TTPs and IOCs. Just a reminder, TTPs are things that adversaries do, and IOCs are things that they leave behind. So if you head over to the ATT&CK website, this is what you're going to be greeted with. It's pretty daunting. There's lots of words, lots of options. It's actually not as bad as it looks. So broadly, if we break it down, we've kind of got a 2-dimensional matrix. We have the higher level tactics along the top, and we then drop down to the techniques associated with those tactics below. And if we think back to the dark depths of history prior to ATT&CK, we had something called the kill chain, which was just a single dimension. So we can think about ATT&CK as describing all the possible kill chains that could exist. With ATT&CK, bad guys move from left to right, starting with initial access, and then moving all the way through to impact. But it's worth noting that the order these steps occur doesn't have to be linear, and people can absolutely skip steps or perform actions that achieve multiple tactics at the same time. So attack's language is very precise when it says things like tactics, techniques, and procedures. This helps us place it on the pyramid of pain, which is hopefully something everyone here is familiar with. Ultimately, it's a way of describing the difficulty of changing a given indicator or an observable from an offensive standpoint. So the lower are you down on the pyramid, the more brittle a detection is, so the easier it is to change. TTPs are very difficult for adversaries to change. It's the way they're operating. You can't do that in the middle of an intrusion. So if we're able to detect people up the top there, we're in a much better position. So attack provides an abstracted view of offensive techniques. Fundamentally, it's an intelligence-driven framework. But this may be self-evident, but it's worth pointing out nonetheless that bad stuff doesn't automatically get categorized into one of those procedures attack has. People retroactively apply those labels to behavior that they can be observed. So because of this, attack focuses on real-world adversary techniques. There's no concept of theoreticals in there. And attack does an awesome job of describing badness in a vendor-agnostic way, which is probably why it's become so popular. So let's talk about using attack in practice. Using attack to map or validate controls is really awesome. It does an excellent job at this. So if you want to try and prove something, you at least now have a data-driven framework that you can do that, right? So you deploy a tool, does it work? Something changed, cool, does it still work? This gets a little bit trickier when we're trying to use it as a defender, because attack does a terrible job of explaining things like the frequency or likelihood of an observed technique, or that some of them are super rare esoteric, and some of them you actually can't mitigate against, right? It also doesn't show you the cost involved in mitigating against any particular thing. So we as defenders as well, we don't necessarily get to choose the impact of a breach, which is the final column in attack. And there's some other things we're not necessarily able to control, like the initial access methods. So one of the interesting things about attack as well is that it really highlights defense in depth. So how weak some of those sort of basic controls we might consider might be. If we look at the picture on screen, I appreciate it's really small. We can see this is what sort of bog standard AV and some sort of edge firewall would get you in kind of a Windows environment. The greens are probables and the yellows are sort of plausibles. And so we can see all that white space would be space that we'd have no visibility, that adversaries can move around it, we would have no viz. So to explain this a little bit better, we're going to dive into a sort of theoretical model I've called car crash. So here's the setup. We keep responding to car accidents. We don't have a common language or framework to describe what's happened. So we've broken down all the various factors along the top into the individual techniques below. How old was the driver? We can actually figure that out by the social media they use. Was the driver impaired? We have a test for fadedness. How fast were they going? Well, we can test that as well. But unfortunately, we don't have any way of sort of mitigating against what they hit, right? We don't have a mitigation against a tree or a pole. And we, again, as defenders, we don't get to control the impact. So let's think about where we can deploy our controls. Turns out we've got really excellent viz into Facebook, right? We've got a proxy, we can see everyone using Facebook. We've also got really good viz into people who are faded. We have breathalyzers on every street, and we're able to detect pretty much anyone who is driving drunk. We have really good viz into people who are speeding. We can detect someone who's even speeding just a little bit. But again, we don't have any coverage over trees and power poles. We don't know how to mitigate against power poles. And again, as a defender, we don't really get to control the impact there, beyond our control. So that goes without saying that people who use TikTok and people who have a strong Pinterest game, middle-aged people, we can't see them. We don't have any coverage against people who aren't wasted. And we also can't see people who are just not breaking the law by their driving within the speed limit. So you might say, who cares? Attack by itself doesn't make this kind of cost-benefit analysis clear. There's whole classes of technologies that we're unlikely to be able to influence, right? Public-facing applications or external resources, you're not going to be able to control. Several of the techniques listed in attack are either unmitigatable or they'd be prohibitively expensive, right? Supply chain compromises are a classic example of this. So here we have two car drivers, Dave and Karen. Dave, as we can see, has a strong Pinterest game. He's middle-aged. He wasn't wasted. At the time, he was driving slowly, and he hit another car, and that had a financial impact. Karen, on the other hand, she exclusively uses Facebook. She was pretty old. She was pretty faded. Shouldn't have been driving. And she was driving too fast as well. She hit a pole, but that also had a financial impact. So both of these two crashes are the same in the sense that the impact is the same, but we can see that the things that led up to them, there's not a lot of overlap there. And if we remember back to the controls we were able to deploy, at least in Karen's case, we had really good visibility into Facebook, and we had a really good visibility into people who were faded. We were able to detect people who were speeding. We didn't have a mitigation against poles, and financial was sort of, the impact was out of scope. So we would probably be able to see this, or at least detect it. Whether we could stop it is a different story, but we'd at least be able to detect this sort of thing happening. Dave, on the other hand, pretty much flying blind. We would have been unlikely to have seen him. So let's leave car crash behind, and let's talk about some of the adoption pains behind attack. So where attack is adopted, it's often adopted from the bottom up. And this is probably due to low maturity, so it might improve over time. I think I've seen one government RFP that mentioned something like attack in its methodology recently. And one of the issues with these bottom-up approaches is that the process changes they often require are locked behind people who make decisions, as opposed to a top-down change where people who make decisions, that desire is kind of implicit. If your boss doesn't understand cybersecurity or technical cybersecurity, convincing them to adopt attack might be pretty hard. And so let's look at some other reasons why adoptions are sort of painful or fraught. Attack has a deceptively low barrier to entry in terms of dollar cost, right? It's free. But the cost of comprehension is comparatively high. So comprehension is really tricky because we can't outsource or scale comprehension in the same way we can outsource other problems. Time is also a difficult thing to quantify ahead of time, especially if you're effectively writing a business case and you need to provide some estimates, right? It's hard to do. And keep in mind, we're actually adopting a framework, not a discrete piece of technology. That requires some amount of constant feeding and watering, and attack is a living framework, right? It had a big update on Wednesday. So there's literally a bajillion half-started assessments because people can't surface their results back to decision makers. This on screen is something that looks like the average organization's implementation of attack, and I've personally seen this firsthand a couple of times. It's really hard to show on a digestible slide, but understanding an organization's requirements, the roadmap, its strategy, things like management buy-in, which can all influence the outcome, they're really hard to show. And this is where those guerrilla adoptions we talked about, they seem to fall down. People start off really enthusiastic, but they end up just fading out. So again, hopefully by being here today, we can at least see and try and understand some of the pitfalls you might face so you can start thinking about ways you might want to address them. Okay, so let's talk about some pitfalls. So this is a true story. We had a security manager at a large New Zealand organization. He probably heard about attack in a CISO magazine, I'm guessing. And he wanted or expected mitigations for all of the things. Coverage across every single TTP on the matrix. So why is that a bad idea? You don't have infinite resources for a start. As we talked about, many of the attack techniques are unmitigatable effectively, or they'd be unpalatable to try and mitigate. So really, if you went down this path, you'd just be fooling yourself. You could notionally ascribe some method to each of the individual TTPs, but in reality, that's just not going to be the case. So let's have a look a little bit deeper. We'll try and cover off both sides of the aisle here. We've got our Tier 2 SOC analyst. She's going for promotion. So she's going to go to the Atomic Red Team. She's going to download the Mimikatz test. She's going to run it, get the coffee ASCII, and now she's confused. On the offensive side, we have the sort of desire to move on from yet another web app, and we're going to do some kind of that cool Redteaming stuff we keep hearing about. So the pen test is going to take his pre-supplied list of in-scope targets, snuffle up some hashes, use CME, and fire out Mimikatz across the entire range, like /24, and get DA, and then we're going to call it adversary simulation. Awesome. So starting with the defensive side, you fire off your tests and you get an alert. Like, why might this be suboptimal? Well, you're testing a tool for a start and one that's touch disk, so it's not staged accurately. And in the case of something like Mimikatz, it's probably got 1 billion string matches in it, right? Like, it's not funny the amount of detection engineering that goes into that. You should be assessing the technique, not the tool. There's a whole lot of other ways you can get secrets out of memory other than Mimikatz, and most of them don't have anywhere near as much of that detection engineering put into them. There's other questions as well. So what percentage of your systems can you see this on? You've almost certainly got some old crusty ones. And when it comes to network-based detections, it's even more difficult. right? You don't have network visibility everywhere. That depends on what segment you're on. And people who are working from home, in the era of COVID, that's going to get worse, not better. From the offensive side, this kind of classic pen testery behavior just isn't something we see bad guys do. So are these results valid? Yes, absolutely. But we need to recognize them as a synthetic result. When an offensive team gets the crown jewels, they found an unbroken path through attack to get there. But there's a view that that's not as useful necessarily as following the path that adversaries are likely to use. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. We have a situation that's natural where red teams don't want to get caught. But the way they often do this is by distorting themselves away from what real adversaries try and do. So we have a situation with life imitating art, imitating life. My own background's in IR, and we have a pretty broad consensus amongst DFIR types that real bad guys look and feel very different to the way red teamers behave, and that's for good reason. But there's more value probably in hunting, say, big game hunting ransomware operator TTPs than there is in doing cool stuff with Yagi antennas for lots of organizations, right? Close access operations just aren't in scope for a lot of threat actors, and especially right now during COVID. Likewise, I've seen weird rules around not blocking an endpoint detection, or in extreme cases, getting infrastructure tracked and burned ahead of an engagement, which is something we're actually able to do for some teams. You could go check out the domains that Jim Appleby has registered in New Zealand, especially if there's a test where defenders don't know it's coming, right? Like this all just skews ourselves away from reality. Okay, so what are some good uses of attack? The question of coverage mapping is what can I see right now? So which techniques should you check? All of them would be a bad idea. Take an intelligence steer. So take public reporting if you want and start with that. And you can and absolutely should do this to an outsourced provider. You don't really need that permission to do that either. Or before your boss goes and buys something. So attack is really useful in this pre-sale space. If you're being wined and dined by a vendor, you should ask them for an attack coverage map, right? Sales engineers seriously have to do this. And obviously there's other factors as well, like who buys the best dinner, what's easiest to manage. But once you have that data, you can now actually assess it, right? So does the product work, and is it going to work in my environment? So we'll talk about threat actor mapping quickly. The overwhelming majority of organizations in New Zealand are defending against something rather than a sort of specific class of adversary. And threat actors, they only want one thing, but knowing which one thing that is kind of the tricky part. So given a resource-constrained situation, which is probably you might be better off understanding what you can actually detect and then mapping new data about intrusion sets to that. So this is one of the finer points about attack, right? We need to be really careful about aging out indicators. Finding and then referring to sort of published reporting is useful for a lot of reasons, but we need to be cognizant of the age of that data. The older the data is, it's harder to make assertions about your organization's coverage. So saying, we've found all these reports, we're going to keep them in a repo, and we can assess these techniques we've covered against X, needs to be heavily caveated. So we'll just touch quickly on the difference between adversaries, TTPs, and IOCs. Broadly, adversary tradecraft evolves, right? So tradecraft represents what adversaries are doing at the moment. Obviously, some things are going to remain useful, popular forever, right? Using a shell is a good example there. But if you limit yourself to sort of campaign or specific intrusions, the TTPs associated with them, you can manage those TTPs much more cleanly. At a high level, knowing what Fancy Bear did in 2016 is probably an anti-pattern for what they're doing right now. And knowing what domains Fancy Bear used in 2016 isn't very useful for us in terms of IOC mapping either. Okay, so here's how you can actually do this in practice. We have here the MITRE Attack Navigator, which is a free resource. I recommend everyone checks it out. And what we have on screen is some pre-supplied threat actor TTPs. So this is a particular group, and this is their coverage as assessed to MITRE. We're also able to upload what our own organization is able to see. We've put our controls into Navigator. And you can actually diff the two. We have a heat map here of both of the sides. So this is really useful data. It's visual, and it's much more digestible than just a report. So on that reporting, there's obviously a big trend to map your reporting data to attack. But if we just leave it there, we're missing so much more of what attack could actually do. Attack lends itself to infographics really, really well. And if people want to fiddle with that data, send them that JSON and the Navigator link, right? It doesn't take that long to become familiar with it. At the end of the day, the more we can make this data digestible to decision makers, the more effort or the more impact we're going to have. People might actually patch stuff, right? So, okay. So I'd like to thank MITRE, by the way, who put out a big change on Wednesday. Almost made my talk quite different. And I'd like to thank all the people in New Zealand who actually share intelligence stuff behind the scenes. They don't normally do it for any sort of financial gain, and a huge amount of this happens in closed groups for the benefit of everybody. And I'd also like to thank CHCon for putting on an awesome conference.